Alright guys, welcome back. You are probably wondering, golly, when is this Cold War thing going to end? It seems like we've been on it forever. And there is light at the end of the tunnel, guys. We are closing in on kind of the end game of the Cold War. And so the next section we're going to look at today in this video, in the next video, we're going to title it The Cold War Matures. In other words, the Cold War is kind of growing up, it's changing, what's going on in the world. That's what we're going to figure out. And we're going to begin by looking at one of my favorite stories, one of my favorite incidents and events from the Cold War, and that is the infamous space race. I find space and space travel and all that stuff really, really interesting. And we're going to walk through just the kind of the big events here. And it begins in 1957. You can see it right down there. Very, very important event. So, let's talk a little bit about the Soviet Union, what they were doing, how they got ahead of us, and then how we were able to catch up in the space race. So this, to kind of begin, this requires us to go back a little bit to a previous war, a war in which long-range rockets were used for the first time, and that war was World War II. During World War II, the Nazis employed some very smart rocket scientists. The most prominent of these was a guy named Wernher von Braun. And Wernher von Braun was an absolutely brilliant rocket scientist who developed the most advanced rockets of its age, and they were called the V-2. Now the V stood for vengeance or revenge. This is towards the end of the war when Nazi Germany was not doing well. And Hitler thought that these rockets would allow him to get revenge on those countries that were on the verge of defeating him. And these rockets were used to target places like London, for example, in England, killing several thousand people, these rockets did. And again, for the time period, these things were almost science fiction advanced. They could fly basically right to the edge of outer space, high enough to see the curvature of the Earth. You know, we had nothing like the V-2 rocket until the Nazis invented these. So the war comes to an end, and Wernher von Braun and some of his rocket scientist buddies came to America to work for us, and they're going to help us develop rockets that we can use to send nuclear missiles if we need to against the Soviet Union, but also use them to carry astronauts into space. And you can see von Braun talking here with John F. Kennedy, and there is von Braun in his office with some models of his rocket designs. Now, the pinnacle of his design would be what's known as the Saturn V rocket. These things were absolutely massive. It's like a skyscraper with rocket engines strapped to the bottom. These things were absolutely amazing. In fact, there it is in comparison to some other well-known landmarks, the Saturn V. These things were just massive. Now, most of the Saturn V rocket is pretty much just engine and fuel. The astronauts themselves, well, they're just right up here. And the part that actually is going to land on the moon is just this thing under here. Actually, I'm sorry, it's down here. This is the part that will return the astronauts back to Earth. They'll splash down in the ocean. So that is the only piece we'll get back from this entire thing. To give you an idea just how powerful these rockets were, a Saturn V rocket, while in takeoff, burns 15 tons of fuel per second. 15 tons of fuel per second. Now, let's kind of wind the clock back for a second. Let's go back to towards the end of the 1950s. The Soviet Union shocks the world by using a rocket to put into orbit the first artificial satellite. Now, it was called Sputnik, which means traveling companion in Russian. It didn't do a whole lot. It just traveled around the Earth, beeping, basically. That's about all it did. It was about the size of a basketball, weighed just a little bit less than 1,000 pounds. It doesn't seem like a big deal to us in the modern age, but this was a gigantic deal in the 1950s. The idea that the Soviets could put a metal object into orbit, that means above us, potentially, right? And who knows, maybe they could put a nuclear bomb in there or something. So this was really, really scary for us. Now, they followed up Sputnik 1 with Sputnik 2. And Sputnik 2 was the first rocket to carry a living thing into space. And her name was Laika. Laika was basically a stray dog from the streets of Moscow. And they put her into this rocket. They sent her up. And this was meant to be a one-way trip. And in fact, it was a one-way trip. She died shortly after takeoff. There's a malfunction in which she overheated and died. The Soviets they weren't open to that idea. They basically claimed she was up there for quite a while safely, and then she was painlessly euthanized, and then it re-entered the orbit, in which case it would burn up. So Laika, first living creature ever go into space. She was the very tip of the rocket. There's her little compartment. This would sit at the very top of the rocket. But as I said, it's a one-way trip. And you can see some images here. We've got some sort of statue dedicated to Laika in Russia. All right, so as we talked about a moment ago, Soviet satellites, extremely scary to us because it rocks our self-confidence. We thought we were the most scientifically advanced country in the world. After all, we'd come up with the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb. We have computers and you name it. And then the Soviets were able to do this, to leapfrog ahead of us. That really scared us. And so it's going to change how we look at our space agency and also our educational system. We're going to establish this thing called the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA, which of course is still around with us. This will be like one government agency to combine the efforts of other agencies that have been working more or less independently to get us ahead in this space race. Now, this, as I said, has an effect on school. So before this the launch of Sputnik, American schools were probably not as tough as Russian schools. The kids had shorter hours, longer summers, all that stuff. And it was decided that for us to catch up with the Soviets, what we had to do is really emphasize things like science and math. That way we have a future generation of American scientists and engineers to go build the technology we need to stay ahead of the Soviets. So if you ever wonder why you have to learn so much science and math in school, one of the reasons is our response to Sputnik. We could not fall behind. By the way, just a little side note here, we called our space people astronauts. The Russians called them cosmonauts. And speaking of cosmonaut, there is the very first human being ever to go into orbit, Yuri Gagarin. This is April 12, 1961. So yet again, the Soviets have beat us to the punch. They put a man into orbit, and we can barely get our rockets off the ground. We looked, frankly, kind of pathetic and really behind the Soviets. Gagarin, of course, an enormous hero for the Soviet Union. Lots of propaganda value in this. For the Soviets, they would point to this and say, see, communism is the way of the future. Our system is better than your system. In 1963, the Soviets sent up the very first woman into space. Valentina Tereshkova was her name. The Americans never sent a woman into space until the 1980s, so about 20 years after the Soviets, before America finally put a woman into space. Another accomplishment the Soviets beat us to is in 1965 they had the first spacewalk. A spacewalk is also known as an extravehicular activity, or EVA. All that means is you literally go outside the spacecraft. You're tethered to it, but you're outside floating in space, which I think this would be absolutely terrifying. Yeah, this is pretty cool. Now, why are they doing this? It's not just to show that they can do this first. EVAs, or extravehicular activity, is very important. In space travel, you have to be able to go outside the spacecraft to repair or change things on the outside if need be. So this is one of those steps that you have to accomplish before you can go to the next step, like going to the moon. And speaking of the moon, the United States, had fallen behind. That we were second to putting up satellites, we were second to putting up a person into space, and so forth. And so in 1961, our president, John F. Kennedy, said that we had to make it a priority, a national priority, to land on the moon by the end of the decade. By the decade, he means the 1960s. And this becomes just yet another battleground in the Cold War, a metaphorical battleground, of course. Now, as we all know, in retrospect, we do eventually catch up and surpass the Soviets. And there's really one good reason. That's the reason. We had more money, right? We had way more money than the Soviets had to throw at this problem. And eventually, of course, we do win the space race by getting to the moon first. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong of Ohio and Buzz Aldrin land on the moon. Neil Armstrong landed on the moon first, as far as walking on the moon anyways, and then Buzz Aldrin accompanied him shortly thereafter. Michael Collins was the third astronaut. He was orbiting the moon in a different spacecraft. And this was a moment. I'm obviously not old enough to remember this because I wasn't around, but people who do remember watching this live on TV. Hundreds of millions of people across the world were all watching this at the same time. It was one of those shared experiences that everyone remembers, and what a moment it was. All right, so that's kind of a quick summary of the space race itself. The Soviets had gotten out way ahead of us with things like Yuri Gagarin going into space first. Of course, that was actually preceded by Sputnik, the first satellite, but America eventually caught up and beat the Soviets. All right, the last topic we're going to look at in this video is a sort of a warming up of friendship between us and the Soviets in the 1970s, and it's known as Detente. And if you think about the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, you think, of course, of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We came so close to utter nuclear annihilation, and this left both sides hoping to prevent something like this again in the future. So both sides had a pretty strong interest in preventing another future Cuban Missile Crisis or something similar to that, where the world hangs on the edge of utter destruction. And so by the early 1970s, both sides, the Soviets and the Americans, are looking for a way to kind of move away from that period of nuclear confrontation. And we know this period of relaxed Cold War tensions as détente. Détente is French, means to like release tension or relax. And that's the period we talk about with détente, is this relaxation of tensions between us and the Soviets. And we associate this policy with Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968. And Nixon visited both China and the Soviet Union as president, which was a big deal to go to those two communist superpowers, meet with those people in person. It really, for him to go there personally, made it more likely that things could sort of get done and tensions could be reduced between our two countries. There is Nixon arriving in Air Force One with his wife Pat Nixon there in Moscow. And so under détente, what's going to happen is, rather than just focusing on military strength and outnumbering them in terms of nuclear weapons or whatever, we're going to focus more on negotiation to try to restrain the Soviets. And there's Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union during this time period, the second longest serving Soviet leader in its history, second only to Joseph Stalin. All right, now we're going to look at something called SALT, and this has nothing to do with what's on your dinner table. This stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And there are a lot of advantages of limiting nuclear arsenal, right? You can save money, you can, of course, make the world safer. And in 1972, the two sides, the Americans and the Soviets, are going to agree to a treaty called SALT I. Again, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Strategic arms simply means nuclear weapons, basically, is what we're talking about. And this would put a freeze on the number of ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles, both sides could have. So we're not necessarily cutting down on the number of nuclear bombs at this point, but we're kind of putting a freeze on the number of that we can have. So we've got to stop the growth before we can roll that growth back, basically. Now, what would have happened next is hard to say. Would détente have continued into the modern day? Would the Soviet Union still be around? It's hard to say. We have no idea. But what we do know is all that is off the table shortly after SALT I, because Nixon finds himself in the middle of what's known as the Watergate scandal. And it takes him down. He has to resign, the only president ever to resign in American history. And so now it's up to his successors, people like Gerald Ford, his immediate successor, and then Jimmy Carter, to continue to sign these agreements with the Soviets. And that brings us to SALT II, which would have put a ceiling on the number of nuclear weapons both sides could have. So this would have been a major step forward in lessening the nuclear tensions and making the world safer. That never actually goes into effect. And the reason has to do with what the Soviet Union is going to do in 1979, and they're going to invade Afghanistan. We're going to talk about why they do that a little bit later. But that really, frankly, got us really concerned, and we're like, no thank you, we're not going to sign with this guy. All right, we are going to pause here, and in our next video, we're going to look at some major problems facing the Soviet economy and what helps lead to the weakening of the Soviet Union, a weakening that, frankly, is going to be irreversible. To quickly review what we covered in this video, we talked about the space race, how the Soviets beat us to the first satellite, to the first person in space, first spacewalk, all that stuff. But America is eventually able to overcome it through scientific know-how and lots of money. And we won the space race by getting the moon first on July 20th, 1969. We also looked at Detente, this period of relaxation of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1970s. That's it for this video, guys.